On June 22nd, 2026, the city of Manhattan continued doing what it always does. Traffic moved, conversations overlapped, the noise that never fully stops kept going. But inside an apartment on Park Avenue, something ended that the music world will spend years processing. Clive Davis, the man who more than perhaps any other single individual shaped the sound of modern American music across 6 decades, died at his home at the age of 94, surrounded by his family. The statement his children released in the hours afterward was not the kind of carefully worded public relations document that typically follows the death of someone powerful and famous. It was something rawer than that, something that stopped people mid-scroll and made them read it twice, not because of what it said about the industry legend, but because of what it revealed about the father. And that gap between the public monument and the private man is where the real story of Clive Davis actually lives. He was born on April 4th, 1932, in the Crown Heights neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York, to a father who worked as an electrician and a traveling salesman and a mother named Florence. The circumstances of his early life were modest, but they were stable enough until they were not. By the time Clive Davis was a teenager, both of his parents had died within 2 years of each other. He was effectively an orphan, taken in by his married sister in Queens, navigating adolescence without the two people who were supposed to anchor it. That kind of early loss reshapes a person in ways that cannot be fully articulated. And understanding it helps explain something about the relentless drive that would define every decade of his adult life. He was not operating from comfort. He was building something from a foundation that had been taken away from him before he was old enough to understand what was happening. What he did with that foundation is the kind of story that sounds too neat to be real until you look at the details and realize it is simply what happened. He enrolled at New York University, graduated with a degree in political science with top academic honors in 1953, and then received a full scholarship to Harvard Law School. From a teenager who had lost both parents and moved in with relatives, to Harvard Law School on a full scholarship. The distance between those 2 points, measured in determination and intellectual ability, is extraordinary. He graduated from Harvard Law in 1956 and went to work at a law firm in New York, which is where almost anyone else in his position would have stayed for the rest of their career. But fate has a way of redirecting people whose instincts are bigger than their current circumstances. And the redirect for Clive Davis came through a corporate connection that turned out to change not just his life, but the course of popular music. His law firm represented CBS, and through that relationship, he was brought in as assistant counsel for Columbia Records, a CBS subsidiary. He was 28 years old. He had no background in music production, no experience in the creative side of the entertainment business, and no particular reason to believe that this was anything other than a legal job that happened to be located in a more interesting industry than most. What nobody in that office could have predicted was that the lawyer from Brooklyn was carrying something that could not be taught or purchased or developed through professional training. He had an ear, not just a good ear, but what the people who worked with him over the decades consistently described as a supernatural ability to hear a voice, hear a song, hear an artist in a room, and know with a certainty that defied rational explanation whether what he was listening to was going to matter. He moved through the company with a speed that reflected both his intellectual capacity and the quality of his judgment. From assistant counsel to general counsel, from general counsel to administrative vice president, and by 1967, at 35 years old, he was the president of Columbia Records. The lawyer who had entered the music industry through the back door of a legal office was now running one of the most powerful record labels in the world. And what he did with that position established a template that would define every chapter of his career afterward. The roster he built during his Columbia years reads less like a list of signings and more like a curated history of the most important music of an era. Janis Joplin, Santana, Bruce Springsteen, Billy Joel, Aerosmith, Earth, Wind, and Fire. These were not accidental discoveries stumbled upon by a well-positioned executive. They were the product of someone who genuinely listened, who went to venues when other executives sent assistants, who sat in rooms full of noise and heard within it something specific and durable that others walked past without recognizing. Aerosmith learned about this firsthand when Davis caught them performing at a club in New York and signed them shortly afterward. The band never forgot it. Years later, Steven Tyler wrote Davis into the lyrics of a song, a piece of music that preserved that moment of recognition permanently in the recorded history of rock and roll. The Columbia chapter ended badly. In 1973, Davis was fired following allegations of financial misconduct, a messy and public exit from the label he had built into one of the dominant forces in popular music. The details were disputed, the coverage was unsparing, and the humiliation was real. For a man whose identity was so thoroughly intertwined with his professional standing, being removed that way, in public, with a story running in major publications, was not a minor setback. It was a kind of exit that ends careers. Most people who leave a position of that prominence under those circumstances find a quiet landing somewhere and call it done. Clive Davis was not most people. Within a year, he had founded Arista Records, and what he constructed there over the following decades was the clearest possible demonstration of what it looks like when someone with genuine vision is freed from the constraints of working within someone else's institution. Under Arista, Davis launched careers, revived others, and assembled a catalog that reached across genres and generations in ways that still generate income and cultural weight today. Barry Manilow, Patti Smith, a renewed commercial chapter for Aretha Franklin. The label became a powerhouse not through formula or market research, but through the consistent application of one man's judgment about what was worth bringing into the world. And then in 1983, came the moment that would define more than any other single decision the full scope of what Clive Davis's instincts were capable of producing. He was at a small nightclub in Manhattan called Sweet Waters when he encountered a 19-year-old performing in her mother's cabaret act. She had not released a single record. She had no commercial track record, no proven audience, no industry machinery behind her. She had a voice. Davis signed her before he left the building. Her name was Whitney Houston. What followed over the next 3 decades, the more than 200 million records sold worldwide, the sold-out stadium tours, the film soundtrack that became one of the best-selling albums in history, the voice that became the benchmark against which every subsequent generation of singers will be measured, all of it traces back to one night in a small room where a man with an extraordinary ear recognized something that the rest of the world had not yet encountered. Their relationship was not simply a professional one. Davis has spoken about Whitney Houston with a depth of feeling that goes beyond the language of the music business, and the closeness between them endured through every difficult chapter of her later life and did not end with her death in 2012. He remained connected to her story afterward, serving as a producer on the biographical film made about her life a decade later, ensuring that even in the telling of her story to a new generation, the person who had known her most completely from the beginning of everything had a hand in how it was told. The labels and roles continued accumulating across the decades in a way that would seem implausible in a work of fiction. He co-founded LaFace Records with L.A. Reid and Kenneth Edmonds in 1989, and that label became the creative home of artists who defined the sound of a particular era of popular culture. TLC, Tony Braxton. Usher, after departing Arista in 2000, he founded J Records, and the name itself carried a meaning that only those closest to him would have fully understood. He named it after the middle initial he shared with each of his 4 children, a private signal embedded in a very public brand. At J Records, he introduced the world to Alicia Keys and helped extend the commercial relevance of Luther Vandross and Rod Stewart. In 2001, at the age of 68, with decades of achievement already behind him and every justification in the world to step back and accept the recognition that had been accumulating for years, the music industry named him the premier talent discovery executive on the planet. 68 years old, still the best in the world at the thing he had spent his whole life doing. The fortune he leaves behind reflects the full arc of that career, and it is substantial in a way that requires some unpacking to fully appreciate. Estimates place his estate at somewhere in the range of $850 million, with some sources suggesting the number may be higher. The foundation of that wealth was a cumulative compensation of 6 decades at the highest levels of the music industry, with roles that included the presidency of Columbia Records, the founding of multiple labels, the chairmanship of the RCA Music Group, and his position as chief creative officer at Sony Music Entertainment. Each of those roles came with compensation structures appropriate to someone operating at that level, compounding over a career of unusual length and consistency. But Davis was not someone who allowed his wealth to sit passively. He assembled a significant art collection over the decades, acquiring works by Pablo Picasso, Marc Chagall, and Andy Warhol, a collection that experts have estimated at more than $100 million on its own, and which has almost certainly grown in value in the years since those estimates were made. He owned a duplex apartment on Park Avenue in Manhattan, one of the most expensive residential addresses in the country, as well as an estate in Pound Ridge in Westchester County. He founded his own private equity firm focused on commercial real estate, building a portfolio that extended his financial interests well beyond the music industry and into multifamily housing at a scale that represented serious institutional investment rather than a side interest. And then there are the royalty streams, the ongoing financial return from decades of involvement with music that people are still discovering, still streaming, still licensing for films and advertisements and new recordings. That income does not have an end date. It compounds across time in a way that makes it genuinely difficult to fully calculate. Behind all of it, woven through every professional achievement and every financial decision, was a family he clearly considered the truest measure of what he had built. He was married twice, first in the late 1950s, and then through a second marriage that lasted until the mid-1980s. And both relationships gave him 4 children whose lives reflect the values he carried throughout his own. His eldest son built a significant career in media investment banking. His daughter became an entertainment attorney and an arts professor at New York University's Tisch School of the Arts, the very program that bears her father's name after the $10 million in donations he made to establish and sustain it. His son Mitchell became an entertainment executive and concert promoter. His youngest son Doug followed most directly in his father's professional footsteps, building a career as a music executive and Grammy Award-winning record producer. The professional lives of his children read like a deliberate continuation of everything he spent his life building, which may be the most personal form of legacy a person in his position can leave. He lived to know 8 grandchildren, and even saw the arrival of 2 great-grandchildren before he died. And the picture of him that emerges from those who knew him in his later personal life is of someone who understood, with real clarity, what actually mattered. In a birthday message he shared in 2021, he wrote about spending the occasion surrounded by children and grandchildren, and about the imminent arrival of a new great-grandchild, and described his family, his friends, and his continuing work as the things that kept him feeling present and alive. He shared the later years of his life with a longtime partner named Greg Schriefer, and the two divided their time between the Park Avenue apartment and the Westchester estate. In his memoir, published in 2013, Davis publicly discussed his bisexuality, a disclosure that generated significant conversation at the time, and that he spoke about with characteristic directness, as something that belonged in the account of his life, because it was true, and because honesty about who he was seemed more important to him than any of the calculations about image and reception that someone in his position might reasonably have made. The statement his children released when he died is a document that will probably be read most widely in the years ahead, more than any industry profile or financial assessment, because it captures something about him that all the Grammy Awards and Hall of Fame inductions and record sales figures cannot fully reach. They wrote about the world knowing their father as a legendary figure whose vision and pursuit of excellence shaped the sound of countless lives, and then they wrote about who he was to them, the steady presence at the center of everything, the source of wisdom and encouragement and unconditional love, the man who showed up not just at the Grammy Gala, but at the table in a way that actually counts. They wrote that family was his greatest pride and his deepest joy, and that he led his family with grace and generosity and kindness. Those are not the words that get written about someone who is only a professional phenomenon. Those are the words that describe a person who understood what the whole thing was actually for. The institutional legacy he leaves behind in the music world is almost too large to compress into a coherent summary. He won 5 Grammy Awards across his career, including a Trustees Award and a Lifetime Achievement Award. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a non-performer, one of the rarest and most meaningful recognitions the industry can confer, requiring that the recipient be considered genuinely transformative to form rather than simply excellent within it. He donated $10 million to NYU's Tisch School of the Arts across 2 separate gifts, establishing a program that has trained an entire generation of music industry professionals, effectively ensuring that his influence in the industry will continue through the people he helped educate long after the specific decisions he made in specific rooms can no longer be traced back to him. His annual pre-Grammy Gala was for decades one of the most sought-after invitations in entertainment, a gathering that drew artists, executives, cultural figures, and heads of state not because of the prestige of the event itself, but because of the prestige of the man hosting it. Being introduced by Clive Davis in that room meant something. In 2025, at 92 years old, he hosted the 50th anniversary edition of that event, which also raised money for communities devastated by the wildfires that had torn through Los Angeles earlier that year. He was still the person everyone came to see, still the person whose judgment meant something, whose attention carried weight, whose presence in a room altered its character. A former president of the United States appeared in a video tribute at one of his most recent events and reflected on what Davis had contributed to the culture. That is not a footnote in a career. That is the measure of it. What ultimately separates Clive Davis from the long list of powerful people who built significant fortunes in significant industries is not the roster of artists he signed, or the labels he founded, or the financial empire he assembled alongside the music. It is the duration and consistency of his relevance in a business that typically chews through its most brilliant figures within a single decade and discards them before they reach 50. Davis remained genuinely influential, genuinely sought after, and genuinely at the center of the industry he had helped build for more than 60 years. He was still working as chief creative officer at Sony Music Entertainment into his 90s. He was still the person new artists wanted to impress. He was still, to the people who understood the industry from the inside, the standard against which all other music executives were measured. From an orphaned teenager in Queens with no safety net and no guarantee of anything, to a 94-year-old man dying at home on Park Avenue, surrounded by his children and grandchildren and a partner who loved him, with a fortune approaching $1 billion, a family that described him as the steady presence at the center of their lives, and a body of work that amounts to the soundtrack of the entire modern era of American music. The money is remarkable. The legacy is extraordinary. But it is that family statement, the one that made people read it twice and feel something unexpected, that tells you what all of it actually added up to in the end.